When my mother-in-law Eleanor changed the locks on Meadowbrook Estate while I was fighting for my life in the ICU, I knew our relationship had reached its breaking point. I watched from my hospital bed as she texted James photos of my personal belongings stacked in cardboard boxes on the driveway, claiming she was finally cleaning up this place properly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Eleanor didn't realize as she gleefully rearranged my home and discarded my memories was that every inch of that property, from the sprawling gardens to the century-old oak floors her son had grown up walking on, belonged solely to me. The deed, the bank accounts, even the vintage furniture she was so hastily replacing with her own gaudy pieces, all legally mine. I didn't say a word as I watched her Instagram updates showcasing her home renovation rescue mission. I simply smiled, signed my discharge papers, and asked my friend Sophia to drive me to Riverside Cafe, not home. There, I calmly called Samuel Parker, my attorney, and with one phone call set in motion the legal storm that would wash away Eleanor's carefully constructed illusion of control. It still feels surreal describing that moment. The perfect collision of shock, betrayal, and unexpected power that changed everything between me and the woman who had spent 7 years trying to erase me from her son's life. To understand how we reached this breaking point, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to when I first met James, but to that frigid January morning when I inherited Meadowbrook Estate and unknowingly set Eleanor Baker on her mission to remove me from her family picture. I remember the exact moment I became the sole owner of Meadowbrook Estate, January 15th, 10:43 a.m. The lawyer's office was uncomfortably warm, with winter sunlight streaming through dusty blinds as Gregory Wilson, my father-in-law, slid the thick envelope across the polished mahogany table. "Natalie, I want you to have this, no matter what happens between you and James or what Eleanor tries to pull." His voice was weak from the cancer that would take him just 3 weeks later, but his eyes burned with the same determination that had built his real estate empire. "She'll fight you for it. She always thought Meadowbrook should go to James, directly. But I've watched how you've loved this family, how you've stood by my son even when he didn't deserve it. The estate belongs to you now." I didn't understand the weight of his decision then, or how prophetic his warnings about Eleanor would prove to be. Gregory and Eleanor had been divorced for 12 years, their separation legendary in Silver Lake for its bitterness. While Gregory had rebuilt his life and relationship with James, Eleanor had nurtured her resentments like precious orchids, tending to them daily, watching them bloom into magnificent grievances. I was simply her newest and most promising cultivation. James and I had been married for 7 years by then. We'd met in graduate school, he studying architecture, me finishing my degree in historical preservation. Our connection was immediate and intense, our shared passion for restoring historical buildings, creating a bond that felt unbreakable. When James first brought me to Meadowbrook, I fell in love for the second time. The colonial revival house, with its weathered brick exterior and sweeping veranda, felt like it had been waiting for me. While James saw blueprints and potential renovations, I saw stories embedded in every worn floorboard and cloudy window pane. Eleanor saw an intruder. "You certainly have unique taste," she'd said during that first dinner, eyeing my vintage dress with barely concealed disdain. "James always said he wanted a traditional home, didn't you, darling? Like the one he grew up in before the divorce. Something solid. Respectable." Her emphasis on respectable sliced through the air like a paper cut, small but surprising in its sting. Over the years, those paper cuts accumulated into a substantial wound. Eleanor's weekly visits became exercises in subtle warfare. She would rearrange my carefully curated bookshelves while claiming to dust them. She'd bring groceries we hadn't asked for, then criticize whatever I was cooking. "James has always been sensitive to too much garlic," she'd say, reaching past. me to turn down the stove. "Let me show you how his favorite dishes are supposed to taste." James noticed her behavior but kept peace at all costs. "She's just protective," he'd say after particularly tense gatherings. "She raised me alone after Dad left. We were a team for so long." What he never acknowledged was that Eleanor had no interest in expanding their team to include me. Gregory saw it all with crystal clarity. After his cancer diagnosis, he began inviting me for coffee alone, separate, from the time we spent together as a family. "She sees you as temporary," he told me during one of these meetings. "Eleanor believes if she waits long enough, you'll leave, and everything will return to how it was before you. This house, Meadowbrook, it represents everything she lost when we divorced. In her mind, it should have gone to her, then to James, maintaining the direct line." "But you kept it," I said, watching steam rise from my untouched coffee. "I kept it because it was mine before we married," Gregory replied. "And I'm giving it to you because you'll preserve what matters while allowing it to grow. James is too easily influenced by his mother's opinions. She'd have him gut the place, modernize it beyond recognition, erase its character just like she's trying to erase yours." The inheritance wasn't just about property. It was Gregory's attempt to protect both the estate and me from Eleanor's rewriting of history. When he passed 3 weeks after signing those papers, the delicate balance in our family tipped permanently. The reading of Gregory's will unleashed something in Eleanor I hadn't seen before. A raw, unfiltered rage that transformed her carefully maintained social veneer into something feral and unrecognizable. "This is preposterous!" she'd shouted. In the lawyer's office, her manicured finger jabbing toward me. She manipulated him when he was ill. Gregory would never have left the family estate to an outsider. James sat beside me, pale and silent. I reached for his hand, but it remained limp in mine. "Mrs. Baker," Samuel Parker had said calmly, "the deceased was explicit in his wishes. Meadowbrook Estate transfers directly to Natalie Wilson with all associated accounts and assets related to the property. Your son receives the business holdings and liquid investments as outlined in Section 3. "James, say something," Eleanor had demanded. "This was meant to be your inheritance. Your birthright." I'll never forget how James looked at that moment, caught between loyalty to his mother and respect for his father's final wishes. "We should respect Dad's decision," he'd finally said, but the hesitation in his voice planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind about our future. Eleanor had stormed out, but not before issuing a warning that would echo through the following months. "This isn't over. That house belongs in this family." What she failed to realize, even then, was that I was family, legally and emotionally, despite her consistent efforts to classify me as temporary. Life settled into an uneasy routine after the will reading. Eleanor reduced her visits, but increased her phone calls to James, always when I wasn't around. I'd walk into rooms to find conversations abruptly ending, James's expression guilty and conflicted. We began arguing more, about renovations to Meadowbrook, about holiday plans, about whether we should try starting a family of our own. The estate that had once represented our shared passion became a battleground, with James increasingly taking positions that sounded suspiciously like his mother's opinions. "Maybe we should consider selling," he suggested one evening, 6 months after Gregory's death. "Start fresh somewhere without all this history." I knew then that Eleanor was winning. Our home, my home now, had become too painful for him to inhabit as the distance between us grew. Still, I refused to give up on either the marriage or Meadowbrook. I threw myself into restoration projects, carefully bringing century-old woodwork back to life while my relationship continued to decay. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was on a ladder in the library, restoring the ornate crown molding, when it slipped on the polished floor. The fall wasn't particularly dramatic, just over 7 feet, but I landed at precisely the wrong angle. The crack of my skull against the corner of Gregory's old mahogany desk was a sound I still hear sometimes in my dreams. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. According to the medical report, I managed to call 911 before losing consciousness. What happened next, I've pieced together from text messages, social media, and security camera footage. I spent 6 days in the ICU at Pinecrest Medical Center, with a severe concussion, a fractured skull, and bleeding in my brain. Dr. Chen later told me they weren't certain I would wake up for the first 48 hours. James stayed by my side for the first 2 days, then began alternating between the hospital and Meadowbrook as his mother convinced him he needed proper rest, that he couldn't get in a hospital chair. It was during one of these absences, while I was still drifting in and out of consciousness, that Eleanor made her move. The security footage shows her arriving at Meadowbrook with 3 large suitcases and a locksmith. The text she sent James explained it all. "I've come to help organize things while Natalie recovers. The house is a disaster. She was clearly overwhelmed trying to maintain it. I've brought some things to make it more comfortable for when she returns. Don't worry about a thing." What the message didn't mention was that she'd also called a junk removal service. Over the next 4 days, while I lay in my hospital bed and James split his time between visiting me and working from home, Eleanor systematically began erasing me from Meadowbrook. My antique desk that I'd restored myself, gone. The vintage, botanical prints I'd carefully framed for the sunroom, replaced with her own bland watercolor landscapes. My grandmother's china that had survived 2 world wars, packed away in the attic as too outdated for modern entertaining. But Eleanor's crowning achievement came on day 5. According to the time-stamped security footage, she waited until James left for a meeting with his architectural firm. Then she made 3 calls, one to a locksmith to change every external lock on the property, one to a junk removal service for final clear-out, and one to her designer friend who had always criticized my museum-like decorating choices. By the time I woke up properly on day 6, Eleanor had transformed Meadowbrook into her vision of what it should have been all along. My clothes were packed into boxes labeled "Donate" in the garage. My personal items were stacked on the driveway, under a tarp. My home office had been converted into what she called a proper sitting room, with furniture from her own storage unit. I first realized something was wrong when James came to visit that evening. He seemed distracted, uncomfortable. When I asked for my phone to check emails, he hesitated before handing it over. "Your mother has been helping at the house," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Just organizing a bit while you recover." The hundreds of notifications that flooded my screen told a different story. Texts from friends asking why moving trucks were at our house. Emails from the security company alerting me to new codes being programmed. And most tellingly, Eleanor's own Instagram posts chronicling her emergency home rescue with before and after photos of spaces that no longer contained any trace of me. I didn't confront James immediately. My head was pounding, my thoughts still sluggish from medication. Instead, I asked casually if he could bring my laptop the next day. "I'd like to check on some of the restoration projects," I said. "Make sure everything's on track for when I come home." The flicker of panic in his eyes confirmed everything. "Natalie," he began carefully, "Mom thinks maybe we should pause the renovation work until you're fully recovered. She's concerned the stress might trigger a setback." "I see," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "And the locks? Is she concerned those might trigger a setback too?" His face drained of color. "How did you—" "Security alerts, James. I own the system, remember? Just like I own the house." That night after James left, I called Sophia. Unlike my husband, my best friend didn't hesitate or equivocate. She arrived at the hospital the next morning with my laptop, legal documents I'd asked her to retrieve from my safe deposit box, and a determination to help me reclaim what was mine. Dr. Chen says I can be discharged tomorrow if my final scan looks good, I told her as we sat in the hospital garden. But I don't want Eleanor to know that yet. Sophia's expression was grim as she scrolled through Eleanor's social media. She's completely redecorated your bedroom, Nat. Put in that horrific 4-poster bed she's always going on about. I know. The calm in my voice surprised even me. 6 days ago, this knowledge would have sent me into a rage. Now, it felt almost expected, the natural conclusion to 7 years of escalating boundary violations. But she's made a serious error. Besides being an absolutely terrible human being? Besides that, I confirmed, opening my laptop to show Sophia the property records I'd accessed. Gregory didn't just leave me the house, Soph. He left me everything. The property, the accounts that maintain it, the Historical Preservation Trust. That funds the renovations. James inherited the business and investments, but Meadowbrook is exclusively mine. Does Eleanor know that? She thinks she knows the contents of the will, but Gregory added a codicil right before he died. The estate doesn't revert to James if anything happens to me. It goes to the Historical Society of Silver Lake. I allowed myself a small smile. Gregory knew exactly what he was doing. He made sure Eleanor could never get her hands on Meadowbrook, no matter what. The next day, my final scan showed improvement, and Dr. Chen signed my discharge papers with instructions for home care and follow-up appointments. Instead of calling James, I asked Sophia to drive me to Riverside Cafe. Seated in a quiet corner booth, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Samuel Parker, explaining the situation and instructing him to prepare formal trespassing notices and cease and desist letters regarding the unauthorized changes to my property. The second was to the security company, revoking Eleanor's newly created access codes and establishing new ones that only I would know. The third was to Linda Carter, the nurse who had been so kind during my hospital stay and whose brother happened to operate the largest locksmith service in Silver Lake. As I ended the final call, I felt a strange lightness. The anger was still there, but it had transformed into something more productive. A clear-eyed determination to reclaim what was mine and establish boundaries that should have been set years ago. Are you sure you don't want to just call James? Sophia asked as she drove me to the empty rental property I'd arranged through Samuel. Tell him you're coming home? Not yet, I replied, watching the familiar streets of Silver Lake pass by. First, I need to make sure there's actually a home to return to. Over the next 3 days, I orchestrated my counter-offensive from the small rental house. Samuel delivered the legal notices to both Eleanor and James, formal documents stating that all unauthorized changes to Meadowbrook Estate must cease immediately, that Eleanor Baker was no longer permitted on the property under penalty of trespassing charges, and that all original fixtures, furniture, and belongings must remain untouched pending potential legal action for damages. The security company remotely disabled the new locks Eleanor had installed and restored my original access protocols. Linda's brother changed the physical locks again, providing me with the only set of keys. And most satisfyingly, the Historical Preservation Board conducted an emergency assessment of changes made to the property, documenting every violation of the conservation easement that protected Meadowbrook's historical integrity. Through it, all my phone exploded with messages from James, confusion giving way to anger, then panic, and finally pleading. Eleanor called so relentlessly that I had to block her number. She switched to email, her messages becoming increasingly frantic, as she realized the extent of her miscalculation. "This is a family matter," she wrote in her final attempt before I blocked her email as well. "You're being hysterical and unreasonable. James agrees we only did what was necessary while you recover. The house was never meant to be yours. It's always been part of the Wilson legacy, not something for an outsider to claim. On the 4th day, exactly 10 days after my accident, I decided it was time to return to Meadowbrook." Samuel insisted on accompanying me, concerned about potential confrontation. The Preservation Board representative asked to join us to document the unauthorized changes, and Sophia simply refused to let me face this moment alone. We pulled into the circular driveway at precisely 11 a.m. Eleanor's luxury SUV was parked haphazardly near the front steps, despite the trespassing notice. Through the tall windows, I could see movement inside, frantic activity in what had once been my peaceful home. "Ready?" Samuel asked, his briefcase containing all the documentation we might need clutched firmly in his hand. I took a deep breath, feeling the lingering tenderness where my skull had connected with Gregory's desk. More than ready. Using my new key, I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer of Meadowbrook Estate for the first time since my accident. The change was immediate and jarring, Eleanor's modern abstract artwork replacing the historical photographs I'd carefully curated, her plush contemporary runner covering the original hardwood of the entrance hall, the air heavy with her signature overpowering perfume. We found her in the main living room, directing two workmen who were attempting to remove the original marble fireplace mantel, a protected historical feature dating to 1876. "Stop immediately." The preservation officer stepped forward, badge already extended. "That mantel is protected under the historical conservation easement filed with the county." Eleanor whirled around, her expression shifting from irritation to shock as she registered my presence. "Natalie, what are you— James said you weren't being discharged until next week." Her eyes darted to Samuel, then the preservation officer, understanding slowly dawning. "What is this?" "This," I said calmly, "is me reclaiming my home. The workmen need to leave now and you need to go with them." "Your home?" Eleanor's voice rose shrilly. "This is the Wilson family home. It belongs to my son." "Actually, Mrs. Baker," Samuel interjected, opening his briefcase and removing a document, "Meadowbrook Estate legally belongs to Natalie Wilson, as clearly established in your ex-husband's will, and the subsequent deed transfer filed with the county clerk." "That's absurd. Gregory would never—" "He did," I interrupted, "and you've now violated multiple laws, including trespassing, destruction of protected historical property, and conversion of personal belongings. The police have been notified, as has the Historical Society." As if on cue, a Silver Lake Police Department cruiser pulled into the driveway. I had indeed filed reports, though I'd asked them to wait before responding, hoping to resolve the situation without their intervention. Eleanor's face contorted, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. "You can't do this to me! James! James!" she shouted toward the back of the house. My husband appeared from the direction of his study, his face pale as he took in the scene. The officers now entering the foyer, Samuel with his legal documents, the preservation officer photographing the half-dismantled fireplace, and me, standing, firmly in the center of it all. "James, tell them," Eleanor demanded. "Tell them this ridiculous farce has gone far enough." The moment stretched between us, 7 years of marriage, of compromise, of slowly surrendering pieces of myself to keep peace with this woman who had never intended to accept me. I watched my husband's face, seeing the conflict, the realization, and finally, something I hadn't expected. Shame. "Mom," he said quietly, "you need to leave." "What?" Eleanor's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You need to leave," James repeated, stronger now. "This is Natalie's house. Dad left it to her, not to me, not to us. And we, had no right to do what we've done." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor stared at her son as if he'd transformed into a stranger before her eyes. Perhaps in some ways, he had. "Officer," I said without taking my eyes off my husband, "I'd like to file formal charges for trespassing and vandalism against Eleanor Baker, and I'd like a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of this property." "You can't be serious," Eleanor gasped. "James, Are you going to allow this?" "It's not his decision to allow or disallow," I replied. "Meadowbrook belongs to me. The only person who gets to decide who stays and who goes is me." As the officers escorted a protesting Eleanor from the property, I finally turned to face James fully. The man I had married, the man I had loved through 7 years of his mother's interference, looked both smaller and clearer to me than he ever had before. "Your things are in the guest house," I told him quietly. "You have until the end of the week to decide what you want to do next." "Natalie, I'm so sorry. I never thought she would go this far. I never intended for me to find out." I finished for him. "Or never intended to stand up to her. Either way, James, it's too late. She threw away my possessions, tried to erase me from my own home, and you let her. You helped her." "I'll make it right," he promised, desperation edging into his voice. "Whatever it takes." I looked around at the house Eleanor had tried to remake in her image, at the gaudy furnishings replacing my carefully selected antiques, at the modern fixtures clashing with the historical architecture, at the ghost of the life I'd been building, erased by her determination to claim something that was never hers. "Start by getting her things out of my bedroom," I said. "All of it, James. Every trace." That evening, after everyone had gone, the police with their reports, Samuel with his assurances of legal protection, the preservation officer with documentation of damages, Sophia with a promise to return tomorrow, I stood alone in the entry hall of Meadowbrook Estate. The house felt different now, violated in a way that went beyond the physical changes Eleanor had made. But beneath that violation, I could still feel its bones, its history, its resilience. Gregory had trusted me with this place because he recognized something in me that matched something in these old walls, a certain stubborn endurance, a refusal to be erased or replaced. As I ran my hands along the banister he had touched countless times, I made a silent promise to him and to myself. Eleanor Baker had tried to remove me from this house and from her son's life. She had failed at both. Whether James and I found a way forward together or apart, Meadowbrook and I would survive, our histories intact despite all attempts to rewrite them. I climbed the stairs slowly, my body still healing from the fall, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. Tomorrow would bring contractors to assess the damage to historical features, movers to retrieve my belongings from wherever Eleanor had stashed them, and the beginning of a long process of restoration, of both the house and my sense of security within it. But tonight, in this moment of quiet victory, I allowed myself to simply exist in the space that was rightfully mine. Eleanor had thrown me away while I was vulnerable, believing she could permanently replace me. She hadn't realized that some things once rightfully claimed cannot be so easily discarded. Not a historical home, and certainly not a woman who has finally recognized her own worth. As I drifted to sleep in the guest room, avoiding the changes Eleanor had made to my bedroom, I thought about Gregory's words from that day in his lawyer's office. "No matter what happens between you and James, or what Eleanor tries to pull." He had known, perhaps better than I did, exactly what his ex-wife was capable of. He had protected not just the house but me, ensuring that I would never be as vulnerable to Eleanor's manipulations as he had once been. In the morning, I would begin the process of deciding what to salvage from the wreckage Eleanor had created, in both Meadowbrook and my marriage. But whatever came next, one thing was certain. I would never again allow anyone to make me feel like a guest in my own home or my own life. Eleanor had thrown out my things, thinking she could throw out me along with them. Instead, she had accidentally freed me from the last constraints of politeness and compromise that had allowed her behavior for so long. Sometimes it takes being discarded to realize your true value, and sometimes the people trying to erase you don't realize they're standing on ground you own until it shifts beneath their feet. The week after I reclaimed Meadowbrook Estate became a masterclass in restraint. Each morning I'd wake in the guest room, the one space Eleanor hadn't completely transformed, and face the systematic destruction of the home I'd spent years carefully restoring. The original crown moldings in the dining room had been painted, over with thick, glossy white that obscured their delicate detail. The hand-carved newel post on the main staircase had been sanded down to accommodate a modern glass banister that now sat in pieces in the garden. Even the vintage doorknobs throughout the house had been replaced with electronic keypads, a particularly vindictive touch given that Eleanor knew how passionate I was about preserving original hardware. James moved into the guest house as I'd instructed, spending his days attempting to undo his mother's most egregious changes, and his evenings sending me lengthy text messages that oscillated between apology and justification. "She really thought she was helping," one message read. "She was worried about you managing such a large property after your injury." Another claimed, "I didn't realize how far she was going until it was too late." Each message revealed more about the man I'd married and how little he understood what had actually transpired. On the third morning, I walked into the kitchen to find him attempting to reinstall the vintage cabinet pulls Eleanor had replaced with modern handles. His fingers were bleeding slightly from where the screwdriver had slipped, leaving tiny red smears on the white cabinet doors. "You're doing it wrong," I said from the doorway, causing him to startle. "Those need to be attached from inside the cabinet first." He turned, relief washing over his face at this small, normal interaction between us. I was wondering why they seemed loose. "I've never been good with this restoration stuff, not like you." "No," I agreed, keeping my voice neutral. "You haven't." James put down the screwdriver, wiping his hands on his jeans. "The contractors are coming today to assess the fireplace damage. I found a historical restoration specialist who might be able to recreate the missing pieces of the mantel." I nodded, pouring myself coffee from the new machine Eleanor had installed after disposing of my carefully selected vintage percolator. "Samuel recommended him. I spoke with him yesterday." "Oh." James's shoulders slumped slightly. "I thought I was handling that." "You thought wrong." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them with a smile or a touch as I would have before. "This is my house, James. I'm handling the restoration." His face flushed. "Natalie, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But we need to talk about what happens next. With us. With the house." I took a slow sip of coffee, considering his words. The James standing before me, earnest, contrite, desperate to repair what had been broken, was the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. But I was no longer the same woman who had accepted his explanations and excuses for his mother's behavior. "We will talk," I finally said, "but not until I've had time to process everything that's happened. Not until I understand exactly what role you played in all this." "What role I played?" "Nat, I was working. I was visiting you at the hospital. I didn't know she was going to change the locks, call junk removal services, rip out original features protected by the Historical Society." I placed my coffee mug on the counter, careful to use a coaster despite everything. "You may not have actively participated in all of it, James, but you saw what was happening and you did nothing to stop it." "That's not fair," he protested, voice rising slightly. "I told her multiple times to check with me before making changes, but you know how she gets. She's impossible when she thinks she's right." And yet, somehow, I managed to stop her with one phone call and a legal notice, I replied evenly. "Something you could have done at any point." James ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "What do you want from me, Natalie? I've apologized. I'm trying to fix what she broke. What more can I do?" I studied my husband, the man who had stood between his mother and me for 7 years, always slightly closer to her side than mine. A good man in many ways, but one who had consistently chosen the path of least resistance when it came to Eleanor Baker's treatment of his wife. "I want you to answer one question honestly," I said. When you came to the hospital and saw me checking my phone, when you realized I'd discovered what was happening at Meadowbrook, what was your first thought? Were you worried about how I would feel? Or were you worried about how your mother would react when I found out? The silence that followed told me everything. James looked away, unable to meet my eyes, his expression a complex mixture of shame and defensiveness that answered more clearly than words could have. That's what I thought, I said quietly. When the contractors arrive, please direct them to me. I'll be in the study. I left him standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the cabinet hardware he'd been struggling to replace, small pieces of a much larger restoration project that would require more skill and commitment than he had demonstrated. As I walked through the house toward Gregory's old study, I felt an unexpected surge of gratitude toward my father-in-law. His final gift hadn't just been the estate, it had been clarity about the man I had married and the woman who had raised him. The study was one of the few rooms Eleanor hadn't completely renovated, perhaps out of some residual respect for her ex-husband's space, or simply because she hadn't gotten to it yet. Gregory's massive oak desk still dominated the center of the room, its surface now bearing the faint bloodstain from where my head had struck its corner. I ran my fingers over the mark, a tangible reminder of how quickly life could change. My laptop sat open on the desk, surrounded by the documents Samuel had delivered yesterday: property assessments, insurance claims for damaged items, the preservation board's detailed report of historical violations. A separate folder contained the security camera footage I still couldn't bring myself to watch in its entirety, though Samuel had reviewed it all to document Eleanor's actions. I sat down heavily in Gregory's old leather chair, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. How had we reached this point? What invisible threads had led from that first dinner with Eleanor, her cold assessment of my unique taste, to this moment of complete rupture? A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Sophia standing in the doorway, a large paper bag in one hand and a determined expression on her face. "I brought lunch," she announced, "and reinforcements." Behind her stood Ryan Wilson, James's younger brother, his tall frame filling the doorway as he offered a hesitant smile. Ryan and I had always gotten along well, partially because he understood his mother's difficult personality firsthand, but primarily because he lived 3,000 miles away in Seattle, limiting Eleanor's ability to dominate his life. "Ryan flew in this morning," Sophia explained, placing the bag on the desk. "I picked him up from the airport after you texted about the contractor appointment." "I came as soon as Sophia called," Ryan said, stepping into the study. His eyes swept over the documents spread across the desk, then back to my face with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," I replied, gesturing for them both to sit. "But I'm glad you're here. There's so much to sort through, and James is—" I trailed off, unsure how to describe my husband's current state to his brother. "Being James," Ryan finished with a knowing nod. "Walking the line between standing up to Mom and keeping her happy. It's his specialty, has been since we were kids." "That's one way to put it," I agreed, unpacking the sandwiches Sophia had brought. "Your mother has been calling the house nonstop since the police escorted her out. She's switched to burner phones to get around my blocks." Ryan grimaced. Classic Eleanor Baker crisis management. When the direct assault fails, switch to guerrilla tactics. He accepted the sandwich I handed him but didn't immediately eat. "I should probably tell you, she called me too. Her version of events was creative." "Let me guess," Sophia interjected, "opening her own lunch." Poor Eleanor was just trying to help her injured daughter-in-law by improving the decrepit old house that should rightfully belong to her son anyway. With a side of Natalie manipulated Gregory when he was dying, and the will wouldn't hold up in court if James would just fight for his birthright, Ryan confirmed. "She wanted me to talk some sense into both of you." I felt a chill despite the warm spring air filtering through the study windows. "And what did you tell her?" Ryan's expression hardened slightly, a transformation that made him suddenly resemble his father more than his brother. I told her that if Dad left Meadowbrook to you, he had his reasons. And that breaking into someone's home and throwing out their possessions while they're in the hospital isn't helping. It's criminal. The relief that washed over me was so intense it was almost physical. Having someone from James's family acknowledge the reality of what Eleanor had done, someone who understood her manipulations from a lifetime of experience, felt like a validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed. "Thank you," I said. "Simply," Ryan nodded, finally taking a bite of his sandwich. "Don't thank me yet. Mom's not done fighting, and James may not be strong enough to stand against her if she really turns up the pressure." "He's right," Sophia added. "Eleanor's been working on James for years, Nat. Every time you set a boundary, she's been there, whispering in his ear that you're being unreasonable, that you don't understand family loyalty, that you're trying to separate him from the people who really love him." "I know," I sighed. "I've watched it happen, but this time she went too far. Even James can see that." "For now," Ryan cautioned, "but Mom's greatest talent is the long game. She'll back off, apologize, play the victim, and then slowly start rebuilding her narrative. By Christmas, she'll have half the family believing she was just trying to prepare the house for your recovery, and you overreacted because of your head injury." The assessment was so accurate it made me wince. I'd seen Eleanor employ exactly this strategy after previous conflicts, gradually rewriting history until her version became the accepted family narrative. "Not this time," I said firmly. "I have documentation of everything: the security footage, the legal notices, the Historical Society's assessment of damages. She can't spin her way out of this." "Facts don't matter as much as you think in family dynamics," Ryan replied, his tone gentle but serious. "Trust me, I've spent my entire adult life 3,000 miles away for exactly this reason. Distance is the only boundary Mom consistently respects." His words hit uncomfortably close to the thoughts I'd been having since reclaiming Meadowbrook. I looked around the study, at the space Gregory had carved out for himself, a sanctuary within the home he'd fought to keep after his divorce. Was that what I was doing now? Creating my own sanctuary within a marriage that might never be truly safe from Eleanor's interference? "The contractors will be here in 20 minutes, I said, changing the subject. "They're assessing the damage to the original features and providing quotes for restoration. After that, I need to meet with the insurance adjuster about my personal belongings." "I'll handle the contractors," Ryan offered immediately. "I managed Dad's last renovation project before he got sick. I know what to look for, and they'll take me more seriously than they would." He stopped abruptly, looking embarrassed. "Than they would a woman?" I finished, raising an eyebrow. "Than they would someone they don't know has final say on their payment," he amended smoothly. "You forget I worked with these guys before. They respect competence, but they also respect the person signing the checks." I smiled slightly, appreciating his tact. "Fair enough. Sophia, would you mind staying for the insurance meeting? I could use another set of eyes on the inventory list." "Already planned on it," she confirmed. "And I've started a digital archive of everything we recover from wherever Eleanor stashed your things. Anything we can't find, we'll document for the claim." As they discussed logistics, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. While James had faltered when I needed him most, my support system had expanded to include his brother and my closest friend, forming a protective circle around me during my most vulnerable moment. The doorbell rang, signaling the contractor's arrival. Through the study window, I could see James emerge from the guest house, moving quickly to intercept them. Ryan noticed, too, standing and straightening his shirt. "I'll handle this," he said, more to himself than to us. It's about time someone in this family stood up to both of them. As he left to greet the contractors, Sophia turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, when this is all settled, when the house is restored and the insurance claim is processed, you'll need to decide what happens with James." I know, I said quietly, watching through the window as the two brothers spoke with the contractors on the front steps. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in James's posture, the authoritative set of Ryan's shoulders. But right now, I can only focus on reclaiming what Eleanor tried to take from me. The house? My sense of security, I corrected. My belief that I have the right to exist in my own space without constantly defending it. Eleanor didn't just attack my possessions, Soph. She tried to erase me, to remove any evidence that I'd ever lived at Meadowbrook. Sophia reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. But she failed. You're still here, Nat. And now she knows exactly how strong you really are. The following days fell into a rhythm of assessment, documentation, and planning. The contractors confirmed what I'd already suspected. Restoring the damaged historical features would be expensive and time-consuming. The insurance adjuster documented the missing personal items, though many remained unaccounted for despite our searches of the attic, basement, and garage. Samuel filed the necessary paperwork for restraining orders against Eleanor, which were granted after he presented the security footage to the judge. Through it all, James hovered at the periphery, helpful when asked, but increasingly uncertain of his place in both the house and my life. I watched him interact with Ryan, noting how his brother's straightforward approach to handling Eleanor seemed both foreign and fascinating to him. Where James had spent a lifetime navigating around their mother's demands, Ryan had developed the ability to acknowledge her feelings while firmly maintaining his boundaries. On Friday evening, a week after my return to Meadowbrook, I found myself alone in the kitchen for the first time in days. Sophia had gone home to care for her own household. Ryan was meeting with the Historical Society about specialized craftspeople for the restoration, and James had retreated to the guest house after another day of strained politeness between us. The house felt both emptier and more mine than it had all week. I was making tea when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Assuming it was Ryan returning, I didn't immediately check the security camera feed. It wasn't until I heard the distinctive sound of Eleanor's voice, commanding and insistent, that I froze, teabag suspended over my cup. The security system chimed softly, alerting me to motion at the front door. I quickly pulled up the video feed on my phone, watching in disbelief as Eleanor stood arguing with a clearly uncomfortable James on the front porch. "This is ridiculous, James," her voice came through clearly on the high-quality audio. "I'm your mother. She can't legally keep me from seeing my own son." "Actually, Mom, she can," James replied, his voice strained but firm. "The restraining order specifically bars you from coming within 500 feet of Meadowbrook. You're breaking the law right now." "Oh, please. Those ridiculous orders are just her being dramatic. No judge would enforce that against a mother visiting her son. I raised you in this house." I watched James shift uncomfortably, his resolve visibly wavering under Eleanor's confident dismissal of legal consequences. This was her special talent, making reality seem negotiable, rules seem flexible, especially for her. "You need to leave," James said, but his voice had already lost its conviction. "We can meet somewhere else tomorrow." "I'm not leaving until we talk properly. About all of this." Eleanor gestured expansively at the house behind him. "About what we're going to do." The "we" struck me like a physical blow. Even now, after everything, Eleanor saw herself and James as a unit, working together against me. More disturbing still was James's failure to correct her presumption. I set down my phone, momentarily obscuring the ongoing conversation. My hands were perfectly steady as I picked up my house phone and dialed. When the dispatcher answered, I reported a violation of an active restraining order, my voice calm and clinical as I provided the case number and address. Returning to the security feed, I watched as Eleanor moved past James toward the front door, clearly tired of waiting for an invitation inside. Her hand was reaching for the doorknob, the new one she had installed during my hospitalization, when James finally moved to block her. "Mom, stop. You really can't come in." His voice had an edge of panic now. "Natalie will call the police." Eleanor laughed, the sound harsh even through the security system speakers. "She won't know I'm here unless you tell her. We can talk in your father's study. She's probably hiding in the bedroom as usual." The casual confidence with which she dismissed my authority in my own home, her assumption that James would naturally conspire with her against me, crystallized something I'd been feeling all week. This wasn't just about Eleanor's actions during my hospitalization. This was about 7 years of incremental boundary violations, of James's divided loyalties, of a pattern that would never change as long as all three of us remained connected. I opened the front door just as Eleanor was attempting to physically move past James. The surprise on both their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. "Mrs. Baker," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "you were served with a restraining order 3 days ago. The police are already on their way." Eleanor's expression shifted rapidly from shock to outrage. "You wouldn't dare. James, tell her." "She's overreacting." James looked between us, the conflict evident on his face. But before he could speak, the distant wail of approaching sirens became audible, growing steadily louder as they neared Meadowbrook. "You actually called them," Eleanor whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. "Over a simple family disagreement." "No," I corrected her. "Over your violation of a legal order prohibiting you from approaching this property. There's nothing simple about what you've done, Eleanor." James finally found his voice. "Mom, you need to leave, now, before they get here." But it was too late. The police cruiser pulled into the driveway, lights flashing against the darkening evening sky. 2 officers approached cautiously, recognizing the address from the previous incident. "Mrs. Wilson?" the lead officer called. "We received your call about a restraining order violation." "She's right here," I confirmed, stepping aside to reveal Eleanor still standing on the porch. "Eleanor Baker, subject of order number 47592, prohibiting her from coming within 500 feet of this property." What followed was both painful and necessary. Eleanor alternated between righteous indignation and tearful pleas as the officers verified the restraining order and explained she would need to come with them. James stood frozen, watching his mother being escorted to the police cruiser, unable or unwilling to intervene. When the officers had finally driven away with Eleanor in the back seat, James turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of betrayal, respect, and profound confusion. "You actually did it," he said quietly. "You had my mother arrested." "No," I corrected him. "Your mother had herself arrested by violating a legal order. I simply reported it, as any citizen would." "She's going to be processed like a criminal," James said, his voice hollow. "Fingerprinted, photographed." "Yes," I agreed, "because what she did was criminal. Breaking into our home, destroying protected historical features, throwing away my possessions, those weren't the actions of someone who made a simple mistake, James. They were the actions of someone who believed she was entitled to take what belonged to me." James ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "What do you want from me, Natalie? She's my mother. I can't just cut her out of my life." "I've never asked you to," I replied, realizing as I spoke that it was true. "All I've ever asked is that you stand with me when she crosses lines. That you prioritize our relationship when she tries to undermine it. That you be my partner, not her ally against me." "I thought I was," he said, genuine confusion in his voice. "I've always tried to keep the peace, to find the middle ground between what she wants and what you need." "That's the problem," said softly. "There is no middle ground when it comes to respect, James. Either she respects me as your wife and the owner of this house, or she doesn't. And for 7 years, you've been allowing her to disrespect me in small ways that eventually led to this." We stood in silence for a long moment, the reality of our situation settling between us like a physical presence. The security lights had come on automatically as darkness fell, casting long shadows across the porch where Eleanor had stood just minutes earlier. "I don't know if I can be what you're asking," James finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I know how." The simple honesty of his statement struck me more powerfully than any argument could have. For the first time since we'd met, James was acknowledging the fundamental conflict that had always existed in our marriage, his inability to fully separate himself from Eleanor's influence, even when he recognized its destructive power. "No," I said, feeling an unexpected sense of peace wash over me. "And I think that's something we both need to sit with for a while." Later that night, after James had returned to the guest house and the house had settled into silence, I sat in Gregory's study, reviewing the day's developments with Ryan. He had returned shortly after the police left, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. "James told me what happened with Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "That took courage, Natalie, following through when she showed up." "It didn't feel like courage," I admitted. "It felt like self-preservation." Ryan nodded, thoughtfully. "Sometimes they're the same thing, especially with someone like our mother." "What happens now?" I asked, not entirely sure which aspect of the complicated situation I was referring to. "Legally, Mom will be released with a stern warning. The violation wasn't violent, and it's her first offense against the order. But she'll know you're serious now, that there are actual consequences for ignoring boundaries." "And with James?" I pressed, voicing the question that had been circling in my mind all evening. Ryan's expression softened. "That's harder. He's caught between the two people he loves most, and he's never learned how to handle that conflict. Dad tried to teach him after the divorce, but Mom's influence was already too deeply ingrained. He said he doesn't know if he can be what I need," I told him, the words still painful to voice aloud. "What kind of marriage is possible when someone admits that?" "An honest one, maybe," Ryan suggested. "For the first time since you met him." As the night deepened around Meadowbrook, I considered Ryan's words. Perhaps honesty was the beginning of something new. Not necessarily the continuation of my marriage as it had been, but the foundation of whatever came next. James had finally acknowledged his limitations. Eleanor had finally faced consequences for her actions, and I had finally claimed the full authority that came with ownership, not just of the estate, but of my own boundaries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Eleanor's inevitable legal maneuvering, James's continued uncertainty, the ongoing restoration of both the house and my sense of security within it. But tonight, sitting in Gregory's study surrounded by the evidence of everything that had transpired, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my accident. The quiet certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, standing firmly on ground that was indisputably mine. The moon rose over Meadowbrook, casting silver light through the study windows onto the desk where my head had struck that fateful day. The bloodstain remained, a small imperfection in the polished wood that I had decided not to remove. Some marks deserved to be preserved, reminders of moments when everything changed, when truths were revealed, when new paths forward became suddenly, starkly clear. Eleanor's arrest marked a turning point at Meadowbrook. The morning after her confrontation on the porch, I woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices downstairs, followed by James's more familiar tones rising in obvious distress. I dressed quickly, still moving carefully to accommodate the lingering headaches from my concussion, and made my way to the source of the commotion. In the grand foyer stood two women in immaculate business attire, their expressions professionally neutral as they spoke with James. Next to them, Samuel Parker was examining a document, his brow furrowed in concentration. James looked up as I descended the stairs, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger. "Natalie," he said, his voice tight, "Mom's lawyers are here with a cease and desist letter. They're claiming elder abuse." I stopped on the third step from the bottom, momentarily steadying myself against the banister. Elder abuse? The taller of the two women stepped forward, extending a business card. Veronica Hamilton, representing Mrs. Eleanor Baker. We've filed an emergency petition alleging a pattern of isolation and financial exploitation targeting our client. Samuel moved to stand beside me, a subtle gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor's legal team. I haven't been served with any such petition, he noted calmly. You'll receive the official documents this afternoon, the second lawyer replied. We're here as a professional courtesy to inform the Wilsons that Mrs. Baker is seeking an emergency hearing to invalidate the restraining order on grounds that it was obtained under false pretenses and serves to isolate her from her son. False pretenses? I echoed, descending the final stairs to stand on equal footing with these women who had invaded my home at Eleanor's behest. We have security footage of every violation. The police have verified the damage to historical property. The insurance company has documented the personal items she removed or destroyed. Veronica Hamilton maintained her professional demeanor, though her eyes hardened slightly. Our client maintains that she was invited to assist in preparing the home for Mrs. Wilson's return from the hospital. She was given keys and security codes by her son, who expressed concern about his wife's ability to manage the property during her recovery. All eyes shifted to James, who looked as though he'd been slapped. That's not, I never said, he stammered before collecting himself. I did give her a key to check on the house while I was at work, or at the hospital. I never authorized any changes or renovations. Nevertheless, Hamilton continued smoothly, Mrs. Baker believed she was acting with your approval and with Mrs. Wilson's best interests in mind. The restraining order, coming after years of what our client describes as attempts to separate her from her only family, constitutes a pattern of isolation consistent with elder abuse. Samuel stepped forward, his normally calm demeanor giving way to visible indignation. That's preposterous. Mrs. Wilson inherited this property legally from Mr. Gregory Wilson. She has every right to determine who has access to it. And Mrs. Baker's actions during Mrs. Wilson's hospitalization went far beyond assisting. They constituted criminal trespass and willful destruction of protected historical property. The legal volleys continued in my foyer, each side outlining their position in measured tones that barely concealed the raw emotions beneath. I listened, a strange calm settling over me as I realized Eleanor's latest strategy. Unable to bully her way back into Meadowbrook through direct confrontation, she was now attempting to use the legal system to paint herself as the victim, and me as the villain. Enough, I finally said, interrupting Hamilton mid-sentence. You've delivered your message. Now I'm asking you both to leave my property immediately. Mrs. Wilson, the second lawyer began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. Mr. Parker will accept service of any legal documents on my behalf. This conversation is over. I moved to the front door and opened it, my posture leaving no room for argument. The lawyers exchanged glances before gathering their belongings. We'll see you at the hearing, Hamilton said as they departed, the statement falling somewhere between a promise and a threat. When the door closed behind them, the three of us stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Samuel spoke. His voice returned to its usual measured tone. She's desperate. This is a transparent attempt to shift the narrative and pressure you into dropping the restraining order. Will it work? I asked, still staring at the closed door. Legally, I mean. Samuel shook his head. It's frivolous. The security footage alone disproves any claim of invitation to do what she did. But it will mean another hearing, more publicity, more stress. He glanced at James, who had remained unnaturally silent since his initial stammered denial. And it will force certain parties to testify under oath about exactly what was and wasn't authorized. James flinched visibly at the implication. I never told her she could renovate the house or throw away Natalie's belongings, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. I just asked her to check on things occasionally. Did you give her the alarm codes? I asked quietly. He couldn't meet my eyes. She said she needed them in case of emergency. I didn't think. That's the problem, isn't it? The words escaped, before I could temper them. You didn't think about how she would interpret check on things. You didn't think about what it meant to give her unfettered access to our home while I was incapacitated. Your home, James corrected, a flash of resentment crossing his features. As everyone keeps reminding me, Meadowbrook isn't mine. It's yours. The statement hung between us, revealing the wound that had been festering beneath our marriage since Gregory's bequest. Not just Eleanor's interference, but James's unspoken belief that Meadowbrook should have been his inheritance, that my ownership somehow constituted a theft of his birthright. I think we should continue this conversation later, Samuel interjected, diplomatically. Right now, we need to prepare for the hearing. James, your testimony will be crucial in disproving your mother's claims. James paled slightly. You want me to testify against my own mother? I want you to tell the truth under oath, Samuel replied evenly. Either you authorized her to make those changes, in which case you're potentially liable for the damages, or you didn't, in which case her actions were criminal. There's no middle ground here. The ultimatum seemed to physically press James back a step. He looked between us, the internal conflict written across his face. I need some air, he finally said, moving toward the door. I'll be back later. After he left, Samuel turned to me with concern evident in his eyes. Are you all right? This is a lot to process so soon after your injury. I'm fine, I replied automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, no. I'm not fine at all, but I'm clearer than I've been in years. I moved to the window, watching James's car pull out of the driveway. She won't stop, will she? This will just keep escalating. People like Eleanor Baker rarely admit defeat, Samuel acknowledged. But legally, she has no ground to stand on. We have overwhelming evidence of her actions. No judge will seriously entertain her claims of elder abuse. It's not the legal outcome I'm worried about, I admitted. It's what this is doing to James, what it will continue to do to him and to us, as long as we're caught in this cycle. Samuel's expression softened. I've seen many families torn apart by inheritance disputes. The legal battles are often just visible manifestations of much deeper conflicts. Have you considered what you want the end result to be here? Beyond simply reclaiming your property. The question struck me as both obvious and profound. What did I want? A restoration of my home and my possessions, certainly. Legal vindication against Eleanor's accusations, yes. But beyond that? Did I want to salvage my marriage to a man who had just revealed he still resented my ownership of Meadowbrook? Who still couldn't stand firmly on either side of the divide, between his mother and his wife? I want peace, I finally said. I want to live in my home without constantly defending my right to be here. I want relationships based on mutual respect rather than power struggles. I turned away from the window to face him directly. I'm just not sure that's possible with Eleanor in the picture. Or with James? Samuel asked gently. I didn't answer. Immediately, the question too raw to address head-on. Let's focus on the hearing first, I said instead. One crisis at a time. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday, giving us 5 days to prepare. Ryan extended his stay at my request, moving into one of the guest bedrooms to help manage the ongoing restoration work while I focused on the legal proceedings. His presence proved invaluable, not just for the practical support, but for the insights he provided into Eleanor's tactics. This is classic Mom, he explained as we reviewed her legal filing in the study 2 days later. When direct confrontation fails, she reframes herself as the victim. She did this after the divorce too, told everyone Dad had abandoned her, even though she was the one who had the affair. I looked up sharply. Eleanor had an affair? James never mentioned that. Ryan's expression shifted to one of resignation. Of course he didn't. He was 15 when it happened. old enough to understand but young enough to believe Mom's version when she swore him to secrecy. Dad never contested it publicly, said it would just hurt us kids more. But it's why he fought so hard to keep Meadowbrook in the divorce. It was his family home, not hers. The revelation cast Eleanor's fixation on the estate in a new light. Her determination to reclaim Meadowbrook wasn't just about control. It was about rewriting history, erasing her own transgressions by positioning herself as the rightful steward of the Wilson family legacy. "Does James know the truth?" I asked. "He knows," Ryan confirmed. "I made sure of it when I turned 18 and Dad finally told me everything. But knowing and accepting are different things. James had already aligned himself with Mom by then. Admitting she lied would mean confronting his own role in perpetuating those lies. The parallels to our current situation were impossible to ignore. Once again, James was caught between truth and loyalty, between acknowledging his mother's wrongdoing and maintaining the narrative that had shaped his identity for decades. "I'm not sure he'll testify against her," I admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing since the lawyer's visit. "Even with all the evidence, even knowing what she did was wrong, I don't know if he can publicly take my side over hers." Ryan didn't offer false reassurances. "You might be right. James has spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of definitive choice. Then what's the point of all this?" I gestured to the legal documents spread across the desk. "If he won't stand with me, if Eleanor will just keep finding new ways to attack, what am I really fighting for?" "Your right to live without manipulation," Ryan replied without hesitation. "Your right to own what's legally yours without constantly defending it." He paused, studying my face carefully. "But there's a bigger question you might need to consider, Natalie. If James won't choose you unequivocally now, after everything that's happened, will he ever?" The question lingered in my mind as the hearing approached. James returned to the guest house the evening after his abrupt departure, offering a subdued apology for his reaction, but providing no clear commitment regarding his testimony. We moved around each other carefully in the days that followed, our conversations limited to practicalities, restoration updates, meal arrangements, schedules. For meeting with Samuel. On Tuesday evening, the night before the hearing, I found myself alone in the kitchen after another stilted dinner with James and Ryan. The brothers had retreated to the back porch, their muted voices occasionally rising enough for me to catch fragments of what appeared to be an intense discussion. I busied myself with tidying up, trying not to eavesdrop, but inevitably catching words like responsibility and loyalty in Ryan's more emphatic tones. The back door opened and closed, followed by Ryan's footsteps heading upstairs while James entered the kitchen. He looked exhausted, the strain of the past weeks etched into the lines around his eyes and mouth. "Ryan's going to bed early," he said unnecessarily. "Big day tomorrow." I nodded, wiping down the counter to avoid meeting his gaze. "Samuel wants us at the courthouse by 9. The hearing is at 10. "Natalie." Something in his voice made me look up. James stood by the island, his posture unnaturally stiff, hands gripping the counter edge as if for support. "I need to tell you something before tomorrow." My heart stuttered, a cascade of possibilities rushing through my mind. Was he going to side with Eleanor after all? Ask for a divorce? Confess to authorizing more of her changes than he'd admitted? "I'm listening," I said, setting down the dishcloth and giving him my full attention. James took a deep breath. "I've been meeting with a therapist since the day after Mom was arrested." Of all the possibilities I'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. "A therapist?" He nodded, his grip on the counter relaxing slightly. "Ryan suggested it, actually. Said it helped him sort through his own issues with Mom years ago." He paused, visibly gathering his thoughts. "I've had 3 sessions, so far, intensive ones." "That's good," I offered, unsure where this was leading. It's been clarifying, James continued. Painful, but clarifying, about patterns I've been participating in my whole life without really seeing them. He finally met my eyes directly. I'm going to testify tomorrow. I'm going to tell the exact truth about what I did and didn't authorize Mom to do. Relief washed over me, tempered by caution. Are you sure? Once you do this, Eleanor won't forgive you easily. A sad smile touched his lips. That's the thing I'm starting to understand. Mom's forgiveness has always been conditional on me choosing her version of reality. Her love has always depended on my compliance. He straightened, something resolute, settling in his expression. I can't live like that anymore, Natalie. Not if I want any chance of being the kind of man who deserves to be your husband. The words hung between us, powerful in their simplicity and the courage they represented. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, James was making a clear, unambiguous choice to stand with me. Not because it was easier, or because it would keep the peace, but because it was right. Thank you, I said softly. That couldn't have been an easy decision. It wasn't, he acknowledged. But it's the only one I can live with. He hesitated, then added, I don't expect this to fix everything between us. I know there's damage that can't be undone with one decision or one testimony. But I hope it might be a starting point. For whatever comes next. I nodded, not quite ready to offer more than acknowledgement of his choice. 7 years of patterns couldn't be erased by a single moment of clarity, no matter how genuine. But it was, as he said, a starting point. We should get some rest, I suggested. Tomorrow will be difficult for everyone. As James turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it took something this extreme for me to see what was happening. You deserved better long before it came to this. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, turning his words over in my mind. The apology felt significant, not just for its content, but for its timing. On the eve of publicly opposing his mother, James had chosen to begin with a private accountability to me. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A small step along a path that might eventually lead to healing, or might simply allow us to separate with more integrity than we had managed to live together. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed at odds with the emotional turbulence of the preceding weeks. I dressed with care, choosing a simple navy dress that conveyed both professionalism and dignity. Ryan and James were already in the kitchen. When I came downstairs, both in suits, both nursing cups of coffee in silence that broke only when I entered. Samuel just texted, Ryan informed me. He's meeting us at the courthouse. Apparently, Eleanor's legal team filed some last-minute affidavits from family friends claiming they've witnessed her being systematically excluded from family events. Which family events? I asked, pouring myself coffee. She's been invited to every holiday dinner since we married. She's the one who stopped coming after the first year, claiming our modern lifestyle didn't align with her traditional values. Doesn't matter if it's true, Ryan replied with a grimace. It's about creating a narrative for the judge, setting up a pattern that makes the restraining order look like the culmination of existing efforts to isolate her rather than a response to criminal behavior. James remained silent during this exchange, his expression unreadable as he stared into his coffee cup. Only when we were in the car heading to the courthouse did he finally speak. Mom called me last night, he said quietly from the back seat, where he'd chosen to sit while I drove and Ryan took the passenger seat. She wanted to align our stories before the hearing. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. What did you tell her? That I planned to tell the truth. That I gave her a key to check on the house occasionally, not to renovate it or dispose of your belongings. His voice was steady, without the hesitation that had characterized his previous statements on the subject. She didn't take it well. I imagine not, Ryan murmured. She said I was betraying her. That after everything she'd sacrificed for me, I was choosing that woman over my own mother. James's reflection in the mirror showed a complex mixture of pain and resolution. When I wouldn't change my position, she said I was dead to her, that I was no longer her son. The declaration hung in the car like a physical presence. Despite everything Eleanor had done, despite the years of manipulation and boundary violations, the finality of her statement struck me as genuinely tragic. She had placed her need for control above her relationship with her son, drawing a line that might never be uncrossed. "I'm sorry, James," I said softly, meaning it despite everything. He met my eyes in the mirror. "I'm not," he replied, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in weeks. "It hurts, but it's also clarifying. For the first time in my life, I'm not responsible for managing my mother's emotions or protecting her from the consequences of her actions. It feels terrible and liberating at the same time." The courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing limestone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. As we pulled into the parking lot, I spotted Samuel waiting on the steps, his expression alert and focused. Beside him stood Sophia, who had insisted on coming for moral support despite having no direct role in the proceedings. Eleanor's legal team arrived moments after we did, the two lawyers from our confrontation at Meadowbrook flanking a third, older man, whose authoritative bearing suggested he would be leading their presentation today. Eleanor herself emerged from a sleek black car behind theirs, dressed in an impeccable cream suit that emphasized her appearance as a dignified older woman wrongfully accused. Our eyes met across the parking lot, her gaze hardening as she registered my presence. Then her attention shifted to James, standing beside me, and her expression transformed into one of cold dismissal before she turned deliberately away. "Remember," Samuel murmured as we approached the courthouse steps, "the burden is on her to prove her allegations. All we need to do is present the facts calmly and clearly. The evidence speaks for itself." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and penetrating dark eyes, entered promptly. At 10, her brisk manner suggesting she had limited patience for dramatics. Eleanor's lead attorney presented their case first, spinning a tale of a devoted mother systematically excluded from her son's life by a controlling wife who had manipulated her way into ownership of a family estate. He presented the affidavits, from family friends, photographs of Eleanor at Meadowbrook during happier times, and finally, Eleanor herself took the stand to describe her desperate concern for her son's well-being after my accident. "James was exhausted, Your Honor," she testified, her voice carefully modulated to convey maternal worry. "Splitting his time between the hospital and work, unable to properly maintain the home they shared. I offered to help, to prepare the house for Natalie's return by making it more manageable for her during recovery." "And did your son authorize you to make the changes you implemented?" the judge asked directly. Eleanor hesitated just a fraction too long. "He gave me keys and alarm codes. He expressed concern about Natalie's ability to handle stairs and heavy doors in her condition. I simply expanded on those concerns to create a more suitable environment. By replacing original historical features protected under county preservation laws," the judge pressed. "I wasn't aware of those restrictions," Eleanor claimed smoothly. "James never mentioned them, and Natalie had already made so many changes to the house herself. Modernizing bathrooms, changing paint colors. I assumed the preservation issues had been addressed during those renovations. The deliberate mischaracterization of my careful historical restoration as careless modernization made my blood boil, but Samuel's hand on my arm kept me seated and silent. This wasn't the time for emotional reactions. When it was our turn, Samuel methodically dismantled Eleanor's narrative. He presented the security footage, showing Eleanor directing workers to remove fixtures and dispose of my belongings. He submitted the Historical Society's detailed report, cataloging the protected features damaged or removed during her unauthorized renovations. He produced the insurance inventory of personal items still missing or destroyed. And finally, he called James to the stand. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as James was sworn in. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her expression a carefully composed mask that nevertheless couldn't quite conceal her tension. "Mr. Wilson," Samuel began, "did you authorize your mother to renovate Meadowbrook Estate while your wife was hospitalized?" James looked directly at Eleanor as he answered, "No, I did not." "Did you authorize her to dispose of your wife's personal belongings?" "No. I gave my mother a key to check on the house occasionally while I was at work or at the hospital. I never authorized any changes to the property or removal of any items." "Were you aware that your mother had changed the locks and security codes during this period?" James's voice remained steady. "Not until after it happened. She told me she'd done it as a security precaution because too many service providers had the old codes." "And what was your reaction when you learned about the extent of the changes your mother had made to the property?" Here, James paused, visibly gathering his thoughts. "Initially, I was conflicted. Part of me wanted to believe she was trying to help despite the methods. It's taken time and distance for me to recognize that her actions weren't about helping Natalie recover. They were about asserting control over a property she's always resented not owning." Eleanor's attorney objected immediately. "Speculation about Mrs. Baker's motives." "Sustained," the judge ruled. "The witness will restrict his testimony to facts within his personal knowledge." Samuel nodded. "Mr. Wilson, one final question. The petitioner has alleged that your wife has systematically worked to isolate you from your mother throughout your marriage. Is that accurate?" James didn't hesitate. "No. For 7 years, Natalie has invited my mother into our home despite increasingly difficult behavior. She's attempted to build a relationship with her despite being met with criticism and disrespect. The only thing Natalie has ever asked is that my mother respect her role as my wife and her position as the legal owner of Meadowbrook Estate." Eleanor's face had gone completely white, her composure finally cracking as she realized her son would not be providing the testimony she'd counted on. When her attorney cross-examined James, attempting to suggest that he was now under my influence, rather than thinking independently, James responded with a clarity that seemed to surprise even him. "For most of my life, I've tried to keep everyone happy by avoiding direct conflicts and clear positions," he stated. "That approach led directly to this situation, where my failure to establish firm boundaries with my mother enabled her to believe she had rights to a property that legally belongs to my wife. I'm not under anyone's influence today. I'm simply telling the truth as I should have done from the beginning." By the time the hearing concluded, the outcome seemed inevitable. The judge dismissed Eleanor's petition, upholding the restraining order, and further ordering her to pay for the restoration of the historical features she had damaged. Her only concession was to allow James to meet with his mother at locations, away from Meadowbrook if he chose to, a possibility that seemed remote given their current estrangement. As we left the courthouse, Eleanor stood waiting by the entrance, her legal team noticeably absent. She made no move to approach us, respecting the restraining order even in her defeat, but her eyes locked with mine across the distance. "This isn't over," she called, her voice carrying despite its controlled volume. "That house belongs in the Wilson family. It always has." "It still is in the Wilson family," I replied calmly. "I am a Wilson." Her laugh was brittle. "You're an interloper, a temporary distraction. James will realize that eventually." I felt James stiffen beside me, but before either of us could respond, Ryan stepped forward. "Enough, Mom," he said firmly. "You've lost, in court and in life. Walk away with whatever dignity you have left." Eleanor's gaze shifted to her younger son, something almost like respect flickering briefly in her eyes before hardening once more into rejection. Without another word, she turned and walked to her waiting car, her posture perfectly straight, despite the visible trembling of her hands. We watched in silence as she departed, the finality of the moment settling over us like a physical weight. Whatever came next, for Meadowbrook, for my marriage, for the fractured Wilson family, one chapter had definitively closed. Eleanor Baker would no longer control the narrative or dictate the terms of our existence. As we made our way to our own car, I felt James's hand hesitantly touch mine. I didn't pull away, instead allowing our fingers to intertwine loosely. Not a restoration of what had been, but perhaps the beginning of something new. Something built on honesty rather than accommodation, on truth rather than peace at any price. Meadowbrook waited ahead, its stone walls and century-old oaks standing as they had through generations of Wilson family dramas. It would weather this storm too, emerging altered but intact, its foundations solid beneath the surface changes that time and circumstance inevitably brought. Just like its owner, spring bloomed across Meadowbrook in waves of color, daffodils, giving way to tulips, cherry blossoms drifting like snow across the lawns. 6 weeks had passed since the courthouse confrontation with Eleanor, 6 weeks of careful restoration work and even more careful conversations between James and me. He continued his therapy sessions, sometimes sharing insights, sometimes keeping his revelations private. I respected both choices, recognizing that his journey toward independence from his mother's influence needed to unfold at its own pace. The house was slowly returning to itself. The specialized craftsman Ryan had located through the historical society had repaired the damaged crown molding and recreated the missing pieces of the fireplace mantel. The electronic keypads Eleanor had installed were gone, replaced with the original brass doorknobs I'd painstakingly restored before my accident. Each returned feature felt like reclaiming a piece of Meadowbrook's soul, and perhaps my own as... Well, James had remained in the guest house, our unspoken agreement to maintain separate spaces creating room for individual healing alongside our tentative steps toward reconciliation. We shared meals several times a week, worked side by side on less specialized restoration tasks, and gradually rebuilt conversations that extended beyond the practical matters of house management. I was in the garden on a particularly glorious April morning, carefully tending to the heritage roses Gregory had loved, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Wilson?" a hesitant female voice inquired when I answered. "This is Margaret Chen from Silver Creek Assisted Living. I'm calling about Eleanor Baker." My hand tightened involuntarily around the pruning shears I'd been using. "What about her?" "She's listed you as her emergency contact for medical decisions," Margaret explained, sounding surprised herself at this information. "She was admitted to Silver Lake Memorial Hospital yesterday after a fall in her apartment. Nothing life-threatening," she added quickly, "but they're recommending short-term rehabilitation care once she's discharged, and we need authorization from her medical proxy." I sat back on my heels, momentarily speechless. Eleanor had named me her medical proxy? It made no sense given our history, especially after the restraining order and failed legal challenge. "There must be some mistake," I finally managed. "Mrs. Baker and I have a complicated relationship. She would never have chosen me for this role." "The paperwork was filed last week," Margaret confirmed. She was quite explicit that decisions should not default to her son James, due to what she termed emotional entanglement. The only other name on her form is Ryan Wilson, but he's listed as secondary and we haven't been able to reach him. The situation felt surreal, like a trap Eleanor had somehow engineered despite her diminished circumstances. I thought of the restraining order, still in effect, that legally prevented me from being within 500 feet of her. "I have a restraining order against Mrs. Baker," I explained. "I can't legally visit her at the hospital even if I wanted to, and I'm certainly not qualified to make medical decisions for someone I'm legally prohibited from approaching." Margaret's pause spoke volumes about the unusual nature of the situation. "I understand this is unexpected," she said diplomatically. "We can continue trying to reach Mr. Ryan Wilson. In the meantime, would you be willing to at least speak with Mrs. Baker's doctor by phone. Dr. Patel can explain her condition and the recommended treatment plan. You wouldn't need to have any direct contact with Mrs. Baker herself. I sighed. Looking out across the garden Gregory had tended so lovingly before passing it into my care. What would he have done in this situation? Despite his justified anger toward his ex-wife, he had always maintained a certain grace in his dealings with her, a refusal to sink to pettiness even when provoked. I'll speak with the doctor, I conceded, but I make no promises about serving as her proxy. There are legal complications here that go beyond a typical family situation. After arranging for Dr. Patel to call me later that afternoon, I set down my phone and stared unseeing at the rose bushes before me. What game was Eleanor playing now? Naming me as her medical proxy seemed designed to create exactly this kind of uncomfortable situation, forcing me to either refuse and appear callous, or accept and become entangled in her life again despite the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish. I was still sitting in the garden, turning the situation over in my mind, when James found me an hour later. "Everything okay?" he asked, noting my abandoned gardening tools and distracted expression. "You've been out here a while." I looked up at him, weighing how much to share. Our new honesty with each other was still fragile, still being defined, but withholding significant information about his mother seemed counterproductive to the trust we were attempting to rebuild. "Your mother has named me her medical proxy," I said, watching his face closely. "She's in the hospital after a fall." James's expression cycled rapidly through confusion, alarm, and suspicion. "That can't be right. Why would she—" He stopped, realization dawning. "This is another manipulation, isn't it? A way to force contact despite the restraining order." That was my first thought, I admitted. But according to the assisted living administrator, the paperwork was properly filed last week. She specifically excluded you due to emotional entanglement. James sank onto the garden bench beside me, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as signaling deep frustration. "Is she seriously injured?" "They didn't give details. Dr. Patel is calling this afternoon to discuss her condition and treatment plan." I hesitated, then added, "They're trying to reach Ryan as the secondary contact, but haven't been successful. Yet." "He's in Seattle at a conference until tomorrow," James supplied. "I spoke with him last night." He paused, clearly struggling with his next words. "Do you want me to handle this? I could call Dr. Patel instead." The offer surprised me, not because James was unwilling to help, but because it acknowledged my potential discomfort without attempting to minimize it. The old James would have immediately taken charge, assuming it was his responsibility to manage his mother regardless of her explicit wishes. "Let's see what the doctor says first," I suggested. "But thank you for offering." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange that she named you, after everything, unless—" "Unless what?" "Unless she's genuinely afraid I'll make decisions based on our history rather than her best interests." He looked troubled by the possibility. "Maybe this isn't manipulation. Maybe it's self-preservation." The insight revealed how far James had come in recognizing the complexity of his relationship with Eleanor, and how his lifelong pattern of appeasing her might appear from her perspective, now that he had finally broken it. "Either way," I said, standing and gathering my gardening tools, "I'll speak with the doctor and decide how to proceed, one step at a time." Dr. Patel called precisely at 3, her brisk, professional manner immediately reassuring. Eleanor had suffered a minor stroke, she explained, which had caused the fall. The prognosis was generally positive, but she would need rehabilitation therapy to address some left-side weakness and slight cognitive impacts. "Mrs. Baker is stable, but understandably concerned about her recovery," Dr. Patel concluded. "The recommended course is 2 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation at Silver Creek, followed by outpatient therapy as needed. Is this something you're comfortable authorizing as her medical proxy?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications beyond the immediate medical decision. Accepting the role meant acknowledging a connection to Eleanor that I had fought to sever. Refusing meant potentially delaying necessary medical care for a vulnerable person, regardless of our history. "Has she been informed that I'm the one making this decision?" I asked. "Yes," Dr. Patel confirmed. "She was alert and oriented when informed. She expressed no objection." That, more than anything, convinced me something had genuinely shifted. The Eleanor Baker I knew would never have quietly accepted my authority in any matter, let alone one concerning her health and independence. "I'll authorize the rehabilitation stay," I decided. "Please ensure her son James is kept informed of her condition, even if I remain the official decision-maker for now." After ending the call, I found James waiting in the kitchen, attempting to appear casual while clearly anxious for news. I relayed Dr. Patel's information and my decision to authorize the rehabilitation stay. "That's generous of you," he said carefully, "considering everything." "It's basic human decency," I corrected. "Whatever our personal conflicts, I wouldn't withhold necessary medical care." I leaned against the counter, suddenly tired. "But I've asked them to keep you informed. You should have access to information about your mother's condition, even if you're not making the formal decisions." James was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You continue to surprise me, Natalie. Your capacity for grace even towards someone who has caused you so much pain." "Don't mistake pragmatism for forgiveness," I cautioned. "I'm doing what needs to be done in an unexpected situation. It doesn't mean I've forgotten what she did." "I know," he acknowledged. "But still, thank you." The next morning brought another unexpected development. Ryan called from Seattle, having finally received the messages from Silver Creek. "Mom named you as her medical proxy?" he asked without preamble when I answered. "That's bizarre." "My thoughts exactly," I agreed, cradling the phone as I sat. In Gregory's study reviewing restoration invoices. "I've authorized the recommended rehabilitation stay, but I'm hoping you'll take over when you return tomorrow. You're listed as the secondary contact." Ryan's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Actually, I'm extending my trip. The conference organizers asked me to lead a workshop next week, and I've been wanting to connect with some colleagues out here." He paused. "To be honest, Nat, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this either. Mom and I have our own complicated history." "More complicated than a restraining order and accusations of elder abuse?" I asked dryly. "Different, not necessarily less fraught," Ryan replied. "Let's just say there are reasons I live on the opposite coast, but I could fly back if you really need me to handle this." The reluctance in his voice was clear, and I found myself unexpectedly sympathetic. Ryan had built a life deliberately separate from his mother's influence. Asking him to return and immerse himself in her care seemed unfair, especially when I was already managing the situation adequately from a distance. "Stay for your workshop," I decided. "I can handle things by phone for now. If the situation changes, we'll reconsider." After we hung up, I sat contemplating this new reality. Somehow, despite all logical expectations, I had become Eleanor Baker's lifeline during her health crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had tried to erase me from Meadowbrook now depended on me for critical decisions about her care. The following week established a strange new pattern. Each morning, I received an update from Silver Creek about Eleanor's progress in rehabilitation. I spoke with her therapists twice, authorizing additional sessions when recommended. James hovered at the periphery of these discussions, clearly concerned about his mother, but respecting my authority in managing her care. 10 days into Eleanor's rehabilitation stay, Margaret Chen called with an unexpected request. "Mrs. Baker has asked if you would consider a brief phone conversation," she explained. "She understands the restraining order prevents in-person contact, but she feels it would be helpful to speak directly regarding some aspects of her care planning." My immediate instinct was refusal. Direct contact with Eleanor, even by phone, seemed dangerous, an opportunity for her to attempt manipulation or simply to cause emotional distress. But curiosity warred with caution. What could Eleanor possibly want to say to me after everything that had transpired? "I'll consider it," I replied noncommittally. "But I'd need to consult with my attorney first about whether this would violate the terms of the restraining order." Samuel confirmed that a phone call would not technically violate the restraining order, which specifically addressed physical proximity rather than all forms of contact. He cautioned me to record the conversation as a precaution, advice I intended to follow. That evening, I discussed the situation with James as we shared dinner on the porch, a habit we'd developed in recent weeks. "She wants to speak with me directly," I explained, watching his reaction closely. "About her care planning, supposedly." James set down his fork, his expression troubled. "Are you going to do it?" "I haven't decided," I admitted. "Part of me is curious about what she could possibly want to say. Part of me thinks it's smarter to maintain complete distance. What does your gut tell you?" The question was surprisingly perceptive. The old James would have immediately offered his opinion or tried to facilitate reconciliation regardless of my feelings. This James was asking what I thought, what I needed. "My gut says there's something she's not saying through intermediaries," I replied after considering, "and that I won't know what it is unless I speak with her directly." James nodded thoughtfully. "Do you want me to be present when you call? Not to intervene, just for support." The offer was tempting. Having James there would provide both emotional backup and a witness to whatever Eleanor might say. But it might also inhibit her from speaking freely, defeating the purpose of direct communication. "I think I need to do this alone," I decided. "But I'll record the conversation as Samuel suggested, so there's documentation if needed." 2 days later, I sat in Gregory's study, phone on the desk before me, recording app ready. At precisely the arranged time, I dialed the number for Eleanor's private room at Silver Creek. She answered on the second ring, her voice slightly weaker than I remembered, but with the same precise diction that had always characterized her speech. "Natalie," she said, neither a question nor a greeting, simply an acknowledgement. "Thank you for calling." "Margaret said you wanted to discuss care planning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm listening." There was a brief silence, then Eleanor spoke again, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of what might have been uncertainty. "The rehabilitation team believes I'm ready for discharge next week. They're recommending 2 months of outpatient therapy before I can return to independent living." "I'm glad to hear you're recovering well," I said, still cautious. "What decision do you need from me regarding this plan?" "I need temporary housing," Eleanor stated bluntly. "My apartment lease ended while I've been in rehabilitation. I had planned to move to a different complex, but those arrangements have fallen through due to my current limitations." The request, or what I assumed was coming next, sent a chill through me. Surely there are short-term rental options available in Silver Lake, or perhaps extended stay accommodations at Silver Creek while you secure something permanent. "Those options are prohibitively expensive for the duration needed," Eleanor replied. "And my insurance won't cover extended stay without medical necessity." "What exactly are you asking for, Eleanor?" I demanded, abandoning pretense. "Because if you're suggesting moving into Meadowbrook, that's not going to happen. The restraining order aside, that would be completely inappropriate given our history." "Not Meadowbrook," she clarified immediately. "The guest house." I nearly dropped the phone in shock. "The guest house? Where James is currently living?" "James would be present to assist with practical matters when needed," Eleanor continued, as if my incredulity were simply a request for clarification. "The arrangement would be temporary, 60 days maximum, until I complete outpatient therapy and my new apartment becomes available." The audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless. After everything, the destruction of my property, the legal accusations, the years of undermining my marriage, Eleanor was proposing to move into the guest house on my property, with my husband as her caretaker. "This is completely out of the question," I finally managed. "The restraining order legally prohibits you from coming within 500 feet of Meadowbrook. And even if it didn't, I would never agree to such an arrangement." "The restraining order can be modified for medical necessity," Eleanor countered. "My doctor would support this as the most practical recovery environment: familiar surroundings, family support available, consistent access to outpatient services in Silver Lake." "Eleanor," I said firmly, "I don't know what gave you the impression. This was a possibility, but it's not. I sympathize with your situation, but after what you did to my home and my possessions, inviting you back onto the property in any capacity is not an option I'm willing to consider." There was a long pause, and when Eleanor spoke again, her voice had changed, the commanding tone replaced by something that sounded almost vulnerable. "I understand why you feel that way," she said quietly. "I behaved badly during your hospitalization, and before. For many years, really." I nearly checked to ensure I was still speaking with Eleanor Baker. In 7 years, I had never heard her acknowledge wrongdoing, let alone express what sounded remarkably like regret. "The stroke has given me time to reflect," she continued when I didn't immediately respond. "On choices made, priorities misplaced." Another pause. "I don't expect forgiveness, Natalie, but I am asking for practical assistance during a difficult time. From the one person who has consistently shown better judgment than I have." The compliment, if that's what it was, sat uncomfortably between us. Was this genuine reflection from a woman facing her mortality, or simply a more sophisticated manipulation than her usual tactics? "I need to think about this," I finally said, "and discuss it with James. This isn't a decision I can make unilaterally." "I understand," Eleanor replied. "Thank you for considering it. That's more than I deserve." After we ended the call, I sat in stunned silence, replaying the conversation. In my mind, Eleanor's request was preposterous on its face. The woman who had tried to erase me from Meadowbrook now asking for permission to live on the property. And yet, something in her tone had been different. The imperious certainty that had characterized all our previous interactions had been replaced by something more measured, more aware of boundaries and consequences. James found me still sitting in the study an hour later, staring at the recording device that had captured the bizarre exchange. "That bad?" he asked, noticing my expression. "Not bad," I corrected. "Just unexpected. Your mother wants to move into the guest house for her recovery period, temporarily." James blinked, clearly blindsided. "She wants to what?" "Move into the guest house for 2 months, while completing outpatient therapy." I don't even know what that is," James said, sinking into the chair across from me. "Delusional? Manipulative? Desperate?" "Possibly all three," I acknowledged, though she sounded different, less demanding, more, I don't know, aware of the position she's put herself in through her actions. "You're not considering saying yes," James said, making it half statement, half question. I sighed, unsure myself of my feelings. "I told her I needed to think about it and discuss it with you. The restraining order would need to be modified, which requires court approval. It's not a simple matter of just agreeing." James studied me with confusion. "But even if it were simple, even if there were no legal complications, you wouldn't consider it, right? After everything she did?" The uncertainty in his voice revealed a fundamental question still lingering beneath our cautious reconciliation. Did I understand the depth of Eleanor's manipulation, or was I somehow susceptible to it despite everything? "I wouldn't consider it without extensive safeguards and absolutely clear boundaries," I clarified. "And I wouldn't consider it at all if you weren't comfortable with the arrangement. You'd be the one interacting with her most directly if she were living in the guest house. Relief crossed his features. For a moment, I thought. He trailed off, shaking his head. Never mind. You're right to be cautious. This feels like another manipulation, even if the approach is different from her usual tactics. I played the recording for him, watching his expressions shift as he listened to Eleanor's unusually subdued tone, her acknowledgement of past wrongdoing, her request framed as a plea rather than a demand. "That doesn't sound like Mom," he said when the recording ended. "The stroke must have affected her more than they're letting on. Or she's finally facing consequences she can't bulldoze her way through," I suggested, for possibly the first time in her adult life. We discussed the situation late into the evening, weighing practical considerations against emotional and legal complexities. By the time we retired to our separate sleeping spaces, me to the master bedroom, James to the guest house, we had reached no firm conclusion, only a commitment to think further and consult with Samuel before making any decision. The following morning, I called Samuel to discuss the legal implications of potentially modifying the restraining order. His initial reaction mirrored James's, skepticism bordering on alarm. "Allowing Eleanor Baker back onto your property in any capacity seems unnecessarily risky," he cautioned. "Regardless of any apparent changes in her attitude, her history suggests she will take advantage of any opening you provide." "I'm inclined to agree," I admitted. "But I'm trying to separate my emotional reaction from practical considerations. If she genuinely has nowhere else suitable to complete her recovery, and if James is willing to monitor the situation closely." Samuel sighed audibly. "I understand the humanitarian impulse, Natalie. But remember that this woman systematically attempted to erase you from your own home. She then tried to frame you for elder abuse when her direct approach failed. These aren't minor transgressions easily overlooked because of health concerns." "I know," I assured him. "Believe me, I haven't forgotten any of it. I'm just, I don't know, trying to find the right balance between justified caution and basic compassion." "If you're determined to consider this," Samuel said, his tone making clear he advised against it, "we would need extremely specific conditions codified in the modified restraining order. Eleanor would be restricted to the guest house and its immediate surroundings. No access to the main house under any circumstances. Regular check-ins with her medical team documented and shared with the court. And an immediate return to the original restraining order terms at the first violation, no matter how minor." The conversation with Samuel clarified my thinking. Whatever decision we ultimately made needed to be based on clearly established boundaries with real consequences for violations, not on emotional appeals or vague promises of changed behavior. I was mulling these conditions as I worked in the garden that afternoon when Ryan called, his voice tense with concern. "James says Mom is trying to move into the guest house. Please tell me you shut that down immediately." "We're considering the request," I replied carefully. "With appropriate legal safeguards and clear boundaries." Ryan's disbelief was palpable even through the phone. "Natalie, you can't be serious. This is classic Mom. Create a crisis, then manipulate people's compassion to get exactly what she wants. She's been playing this game our entire lives." "The stroke was hardly a manufactured crisis," I pointed out. "And her need for transitional housing seems legitimate based on the medical reports." "There are other options," Ryan insisted. "Specialty rehabilitation facilities, short-term medical housing, services specifically designed for exactly this situation. Most of which are prohibitively expensive without specific insurance coverage," I countered, surprised to find myself defending Eleanor's position. "Believe me, Ryan, I'm approaching this with extreme caution, but dismissing the request outright without considering alternatives feels unnecessarily harsh given her current vulnerability." Ryan's silence spoke volumes about his disagreement. When he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted from urgent concern to something more measured. "You need to understand something about our mother, Natalie. something James might never fully acknowledge because of the role he's always played in the family dynamics. He paused, seemingly gathering his thoughts. Mom is at her most dangerous when she appears vulnerable. It's when her manipulation is most effective because it bypasses people's natural defenses. The warning resonated uncomfortably with my own lingering doubts. You think this is all calculated? Even the stroke? Not the stroke itself, no, Ryan clarified. But the timing of this request, the specific approach to you rather than to James directly, the careful acknowledgement of past wrongs without any concrete commitment to changed behavior. Those feel very calculated to me. I considered his perspective, appreciating the insight from someone who had observed Eleanor's patterns throughout his life while maintaining more distance than James had managed. What would you recommend? I asked sincerely. Help her find appropriate alternative housing, Ryan replied without hesitation. Contribute financially if necessary, I certainly would share that cost, but maintain the hard boundary of the restraining order. The moment you blur that line, you've started down a path that inevitably leads back to her controlling Meadowbrook and your life within it. After ending the call with Ryan, I walked the grounds of Meadowbrook, thinking through the tangled situation. The estate was fully coming alive with spring now, the carefully tended gardens Gregory had loved bursting with color and life. Standing amid this renewal, I found myself reflecting on the cycles of growth and change that characterized both nature and human relationships. Eleanor had caused real damage to the property, to my sense of security, to my marriage. No amount of apparent contrition could simply erase those harms. And yet, maintaining rigid positions in the face of genuine human need felt equally problematic, a rejection of the possibility that people could learn and grow even late in life. The guest house came into view as I rounded the rose garden, the small stone structure where James had been living since our separation, where Eleanor now proposed to recuperate. Its windows caught the afternoon light, warm and inviting despite the complicated emotions now attached to the space. What was the right path forward? Compassion with boundaries? Justified rejection? Some middle ground yet to be defined? As the sun began its descent toward the western edge of Meadowbrook, I found myself still searching for the answer, aware that whatever decision we made would shape not just Eleanor's recovery, but the future of all our interconnected lives. The decision regarding Eleanor came to me at dawn, as I stood watching the sun rise over Meadowbrook's eastern meadow. Clarity often arrives in these quiet moments, when the mind has had time to process conflicting emotions and practical considerations. I would help Eleanor find suitable alternative housing, perhaps even contribute financially as Ryan had suggested, but I would maintain the boundary of the restraining order. Meadowbrook needed to remain a sanctuary, not just for me, but for James as he continued his journey toward independence from his mother's manipulation. When I shared my decision with James over breakfast, his relief was palpable. I think that's the right call, he said, pouring us both more coffee. Part of me felt obligated to help her, but another part recognized how easily we could slide back into old patterns if she were here, even temporarily. We'll find her appropriate housing, I promised. Somewhere with proper medical support that still respects her dignity and independence. But not here, not after everything. James nodded, a small smile forming. 6 months ago I would have argued with you. I would have found ways to justify making exceptions, accommodating her demands despite the cost to us. To you. And now? I asked, curious about his perspective. Now I understand that maintaining boundaries isn't about punishment. It's about health, for all of us. He hesitated, then added, My therapist says I've spent my life being the human equivalent of a shock absorber between my mother and everyone else, absorbing her impacts so others wouldn't feel the full force of her demands. But shock absorbers eventually wear out. The metaphor was apt, capturing James's lifelong role in relation to Eleanor. I reached across the table and briefly squeezed. his hand, acknowledging both his insight and the effort it had taken to reach it. Later that morning, I called Silver Creek to inform them of my decision regarding Eleanor's post-discharge housing. Margaret Chen listened sympathetically, agreeing to connect me with their social services coordinator to explore appropriate alternatives. "Mrs. Baker won't be pleased," she cautioned. "She's been quite focused on the guest house plan." "I understand," I replied. "But it's simply not feasible given our history and the existing legal restrictions. Please assure her we're committed to finding a suitable alternative that supports her recovery." The social services coordinator proved extremely helpful, identifying 3 potential transitional housing options that would accommodate Eleanor's medical needs while providing the independence she valued. I arranged for James to visit each facility, knowing Eleanor would respond better to information coming from him directly. When James returned from these visits, he seemed thoughtful but optimistic. "The Willows is actually quite nice," he reported, referring to a rehabilitation center with attached independent living apartments. "Private room, good therapy facilities on site, and only 10 minutes from her new apartment building. The director said they could hold a space for her discharge next week." "Perfect," I said. "Let's move forward with that option." James hesitated. "There's just one issue. The cost. Even with her insurance, there's a significant gap. About $12,000 for the 2-month stay." I considered this new complication. Eleanor's financial situation had always been somewhat mysterious. After her divorce from Gregory, she had maintained an appearance of comfortable means, but I'd never been privy to the details of her resources. "I'll cover half," I decided. Ryan already offered to contribute as well. Between the 3 of us, we should be able to manage it. James looked surprised. "You'd do that? After everything?" "It's not about what she deserves," I explained, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "It's about who I choose to be in this situation. I don't want decisions about her care to be driven by financial limitations when we have the means to help." The look of respect in James's eyes meant more than I expected. Not because I needed his approval, but because it reflected a mature understanding of the complex moral considerations at play, a far cry from the conflict-avoidant perspective he'd maintained throughout most of our marriage. 2 days later, James visited Eleanor at Silver Creek to present the plan. I waited anxiously at Meadowbrook, unsure how she would respond to the rejection of her guest house proposal. When James returned, his expression was difficult to read, neither triumphant nor defeated, but contemplative. "How did she take it?" I asked, as he settled onto the porch swing beside me. "Better than I expected," he admitted. "She was disappointed, of course. But when I explained the financial arrangements, that you were contributing to the cost, she seemed, I don't know, subdued. Maybe even a little ashamed." "Ashamed?" The concept seemed foreign when applied to Eleanor, who had always projected unwavering confidence in her rightness. James nodded slowly. "She asked me to thank you. Said she understood why you couldn't have her at Meadowbrook, given what she'd done. It was strange. Like talking to a different person." "The stroke might have affected her more than we realized," I suggested. "Maybe," James agreed. "Or maybe nearly dying forces a certain kind of reckoning. I don't know." He gazed out across the gardens, lost in thought. "She also asked me a question I wasn't prepared for." "What question?" "She asked if I was happy." His voice softened. "Not just in general, but specifically. With you. With our marriage." She's never asked that before, not in a way that felt like she actually wanted to know the answer rather than influence it. I felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. "And what did you tell her?" James turned to face me directly. "I told her that we're finding our way back to each other. That it's complicated and uncertain and difficult, but also more honest than we've ever been. That for the first time in our marriage, we're seeing each other clearly, without her shadow between us." The simple truth of his words resonated deeply. We were finding our way back, though the path looked nothing like I would have predicted. Not a return to what had been, but the careful construction of something new, something built on clearer vision and stronger boundaries. "That's a good answer," I said softly. "An honest one." Eleanor was discharged to the Willows the following Tuesday, the transition managed primarily by James with support from the medical team. I maintained my distance, respecting the restraining order while ensuring the financial arrangements were handled smoothly. According to James's reports, Eleanor was settling in well, cooperating with her therapy schedule, and, most surprisingly, expressing genuine gratitude for the accommodations we had arranged. Life at Meadowbrook gradually settled into a new rhythm. The restoration work on the house continued, with most of the major repairs now complete and only finishing details remaining. Ryan returned briefly to help with some specialized woodwork in the library before flying back to Seattle, promising to visit again in the summer. And James and I continued our careful rebuilding, sharing meals, working side by side on house projects, and engaging in increasingly honest conversations about our past and potential future. On a warm evening in late May, as twilight softened, the edges of Meadowbrook's gardens, James and I sat on the back porch sharing a bottle of wine. The scent of jasmine hung heavily in the air, crickets providing a gentle soundtrack to our conversation. "I've been thinking," James said after a comfortable silence, "about what happens next, with us." I took a sip of wine, allowing him the space to continue at his own pace. "These past few months have been clarifying," he continued. "Living separately, but working together. Building something new instead of trying to repair what was broken." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I wondered if you might consider making this arrangement more permanent." "You want to continue living in the guest house?" I asked, surprised. "Not exactly." He smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression. "I'm wondering if we might consider redefining our marriage, not as the traditional shared household we tried before, but as partners who maintain separate living spaces while building a life together." The proposal was unexpected, yet somehow perfectly aligned with the evolution we'd experienced, living apart together. I'd read about such arrangements, usually presented as alternatives for younger couples not ready for full commitment. But why couldn't it work for us? A way to preserve the independence we'd both grown into while nurturing. The connection that remained between us? "Tell me more," I encouraged, genuinely curious about his vision. "I've realized something important during these months of separation," James explained. "When we lived together full-time, I never fully developed my own center, my own sense of home apart from both you and my mother. I went from her house to our house, always defining myself in relation to someone else's space." I nodded, understanding, dawning. "And living in the guest house has given you a sense of your own territory, your own domain." "Exactly. For the first time, I'm responsible for my own immediate environment without reference to anyone else's preferences or needs. It's been healing, and I think it's made me a better partner when we are together." He looked at me intently. "I'm not suggesting we live completely separate lives, just that we maintain these separate spaces while continuing to build our relationship intentionally." I considered his proposal, turning it over in my mind. There was wisdom in it, an acknowledgement of the independence we'd both developed during our separation, and a respect for the healing that had occurred precisely because of that distance. "We could still spend nights together sometimes," I said, thinking aloud. "Share meals regularly, work on Meadowbrook as partners, but each maintain our own sanctuary." "Yes," James agreed, relief evident in his voice. "Exactly that. A marriage defined by choice rather than convention, by what works for us rather than what's expected." The idea settled comfortably between us, feeling right in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not a compromise or a half measure, but a thoughtful evolution of our relationship that honored both our connection and our individual growth. "I think I'd like to try that," I said finally. Not as a temporary arrangement, but as a deliberate choice about how we want to shape our future together. The smile that spread across James's face, genuine, relieved, joyful, confirmed the rightness of our decision. He reached for my hand, interlacing our fingers in a gesture that felt both familiar and new. "To redefining marriage on our own terms," he said, raising his wine glass with his free hand. "To choosing each other daily, rather than taking presents for granted," I added, clinking my glass against his. As summer bloomed across Meadowbrook, our unconventional arrangement flourished alongside the gardens. James made the guest house truly his own, adding personal touches that reflected his emerging individual identity. I continued restoring the main house, completing projects that had been interrupted by my accident and Eleanor's subsequent intrusion. We shared dinner most evenings, alternating between the main house and the guest house kitchen, each cooking in our own style. Some nights we parted with a kiss at the door, others we spent together, rediscovering each other in ways that felt both familiar and excitingly new. Eleanor's recovery progressed steadily at the Willows. James visited her weekly, reporting that she seemed genuinely focused on her rehabilitation and, surprisingly, respectful of the boundaries we had established. The manipulative tactics and emotional demands that had characterized their relationship for decades were noticeably absent, replaced by what James described as actual conversations about their shared past and separate presents. In late June, as Eleanor's scheduled move to her new apartment approached, she made an unexpected request through James. "She'd like to write to you," he told me one evening as we worked side by side in the vegetable garden. "An actual letter, not a phone call or visit. She says there are things she needs to express that would be easier in writing." I paused in my weeding, considering the request. A letter seemed harmless enough, something I could choose to read or not, respond to, or not, entirely on my own terms. That would be acceptable, I decided, though I make no promises about my response. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by James rather than mail. Eleanor's distinctive handwriting covered 3 pages of high-quality stationery, her pen strokes firm despite the lingering effects of her stroke. I took the envelope to the quiet sanctuary of Gregory's study, settling into his chair to read whatever Eleanor had felt compelled to communicate. The contents surprised me. Not a justification of her actions or a plea for forgiveness, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of patterns that had shaped her entire adult life. She wrote of the insecurity that had driven her need for control, of using manipulation to create a sense of safety in a world that had often felt hostile. She acknowledged the damage she had caused, to her relationship with both sons, to her former husband, and most directly to me. "I saw in you something I have never been able to cultivate in myself," she wrote toward the end. "A confidence that emanates from within rather than requiring constant external validation. It threatened me in ways I am only now beginning to understand. I responded by trying to diminish you, to prove your unworthiness to occupy spaces I believed should be mine. It was unconscionable, and I offer no excuses." The letter concluded not with a request for reconciliation, but with a simple expression of gratitude for the assistance we had provided during her recovery, and a commitment to respect the boundaries we had established moving forward. I sat with the letter for a long time, uncertain how to feel about this unexpected vulnerability from a woman who had caused so much disruption in my life. Was it genuine growth sparked by a health crisis, or simply a more sophisticated manipulation? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. A woman capable of insight but not necessarily consistent change. In the end, I decided not to respond. Immediately. Eleanor's words required contemplation, not reaction. I tucked the letter into my desk drawer, a tangible reminder of the complex human being behind the antagonistic mother-in-law who had once seemed so one-dimensional in her hostility. As July unfolded, Meadowbrook reached its full summer glory. The restoration work was finally complete. Every historical detail returned to its proper condition. Every modern intrusion Eleanor had introduced, removed and replaced with appropriate features. The house felt fully mine again, not in the defensive way I had claimed it after Eleanor's invasion, but in a settled, confident ownership that no longer required constant assertion. One particularly beautiful evening, James and I sat on the veranda watching fireflies dance across the darkening lawn. A comfortable silence stretched between us, the kind that comes from mutual respect rather than avoidance. "I've been thinking about my mother's letter," James said eventually, "about how much courage it must have taken for her to write it." "Courage," I repeated, surprised by his framing. "To acknowledge her flaws so directly, to face the damage she's caused without making excuses." He turned to look at me. "It's something I'm still learning to do myself, to take full responsibility for my part in what happened, without deflecting or minimizing." "You've come a long way," I observed sincerely. "We both have." James nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think people can genuinely change? Not just their behavior, but the underlying patterns that drive it?" I considered the question carefully, thinking of Eleanor's letter, of James's transformation over these past months, of my own evolution from victim to advocate for myself. "I think change is possible," I said slowly. "But it requires both insight and consistent effort. A crisis might spark the insight, but only dedicated work maintains the change." I paused, adding, "And the people who've been hurt aren't obligated to stick around waiting to see if the change lasts." "That's fair," James acknowledged. "More than fair, really." As night settled fully over Meadowbrook, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. My mother-in-law had thrown out my belongings while I lay in a hospital bed, believing she could erase me from a home she felt should never have been mine. Instead, her actions had precipitated a cascade of revelations and transformations that had ultimately strengthened both my claim to Meadowbrook and my sense of self. The estate Gregory had entrusted to me stood beautifully restored around us, its historical integrity preserved while allowing space for new growth and evolution. In many ways, it mirrored what James and I were attempting with our marriage, honoring what deserved preservation while creating space for new patterns better suited to who we had become. Whether Eleanor's apparent transformation would prove lasting remained to be seen. Whether our unconventional marriage would flourish over the long term was similarly uncertain. But sitting there in the gentle summer night, I felt a profound peace with that uncertainty. Some questions don't require immediate answers. Some journeys matter more for the path than the destination. What mattered now was that Meadowbrook was unquestionably mine, not just legally, but in the bone-deep confidence that comes from defending what is yours against those who would take it from you. What mattered was that James and I were building something new and authentic between us, free from his mother's manipulations and our own outdated patterns. What mattered was that I had discovered a strength in myself I might never have recognized without the crisis that forced it to emerge. My mother-in-law had thrown out my things, believing she could claim my place. She hadn't known I owned the entire estate. Not just the property's deed, but its heart and soul, its past and future. Now she knew. Now everyone knew. And that knowledge had changed everything, myself most of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.